Hey, welcome to week 10. This week we're going to be talking about the early United States and the formation of government. So let's get started. So part one, we're going to talk about the making of the Constitution. All right, and so before the formation of the United States, we had state constitutions. Even in 1776, most revolutionaries agreed that consolidating into one nation wouldn't work. They thought that the government would have indifference to public concerns because of the distance, mainly. The area was sprawling, it was too diverse, and they thought that without having nearby supervision, government representatives would be less accountable for their actions. And they thought that a federation of many nation states would endure. And so most states had a governor and a bicameral legislature, so the two-house legislature that we know of. There was this desire to curb executive power because of the experience with the king. So governors had very little power. They could not convene or dissolve legislatures. They could not veto laws. They could not erect courts. They could not appoint state officials, with very few exceptions. There were a few exceptions there. There wasn't universal suffrage in the states, but most states did lower property requirements eventually, but still this only applied to white men, and typically wealthy white men. So they did have written state constitutions, sort of this guarantee of rights, and this is one of those ideas that's a very solid U.S. idea. So England did not have a written constitution. Their constitution consisted of legal history. So having a written guarantee of rights is something that the United States came up with to guarantee those rights. Contract. All right, so let's talk about Congress. In 1776, so at the period of the Revolution, Congress had power to create an army, issue currency, and negotiate with foreign powers, but there was no document saying that that was what Congress could do. So there was no constitution that said that. So in 1776, a committee was appointed to draft a constitution for national government, and this was approved in November of 77 and was called the Articles of Confederation. And this wasn't ratified by all states until February of 1781. We'll get to that in a little bit. So essentially, this constitution was basically a continuation of the Second Continental Congress. So Congress could not levy taxes and could not regulate trade. Americans were very wary, again, of centralized power because of the experience with the monarchy, and still not very united. Even after the war, there was sort of this lack of a common goal. All right, let's move on here. So I have a map here. Just want to kind of show different land disputes that were happening. So the United States had land disputes in several different ways. So there were land disputes with the British. So one thing was that, this is still British colony up here, and they had forts along the border. The ones that were close to Canada, they kept maintaining. They encouraged and even instructed Canadians to maintain these forts and trading posts, even though they were within the U.S. boundaries. And they thought that when the Continental Army disbands after the war, the United States wouldn't be able to enforce or protect that land. Another issue is that Great Britain tried to steal Vermont. You'll see Vermont is blue here. And you'll look here, it says the Vermont Republic. So for about 14 years, Vermont was like an independent nation. Didn't belong to the United States. So in 1777, Vermont had declared its independence and wrote their own constitution. And Great Britain was sort of like courting Vermont, encouraging them to become a part of Canada instead of joining the United States. And so Vermont was considering that for a while, but that sort of died down, the momentum for that. And eventually in 1791, they applied to join the United States and then were accepted. Okay, so land disputes with Spain. You see, this is Spanish territory here. You can see that this area is disputed between Spain and the United States. So Spain closed the Mississippi River to Americans because people started settling in Kentucky and Tennessee, so in this area. And so they closed down the river, and those settlers who were living there, needed access to the river in order to have access to goods, in order to be commercially viable. And so a lot of those folks considered becoming Spanish so they could use the river. Spain as well rallied different native groups to their side with sort of this common cause to protect Spanish Florida down here from Georgians that were starting to creep over the border. So protecting the people who lived there. And so in 1784, we have this alliance between Spain and the Creek people. And then the Choctaws and Chickasaws joined as well. So this was an area where, not super safe for the English settlers to be venturing. Or, I'm sorry, they're not English anymore, are they? For the U.S. settlers to be venturing. All right, and then we have different territorial disputes among the states themselves. So these disputes were over how far west the state borders went. And so some royal charters had said that these states went all the way over to the Mississippi River. So this is landed versus landless. Landed states are these states in here who had the ability to creep west all the way over. And that's what they were claiming to do. They were trying to claim that their state went all the way to the Mississippi River. And the landless states are states like Massachusetts, like Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, all in here, Maryland, the ones that have nowhere else to go. So they don't have the option of expanding. And so landed states, again, wanted to push all the way to the west. And these landless states wanted Congress to restrict those boundaries. The Articles of Confederation acknowledged the old charter claims, so it did say that they would go all the way to the river. And so Maryland retaliated by not ratifying the Articles of Confederation. And a lot of states held out on ratifying that until it was changed. Because they needed every state to ratify the Articles of Confederation in order for it to be official, landed states just held out, and eventually, landless states held out, and landed states ended up giving up their rights to push all the way to the Mississippi. Virginia was the last one to give up, and that was in 1781, and 1781 is when the articles were ratified because all the states agreed. Okay, let's go here. We do have changing government makeup. So before the Revolution, less than 1/5 of assemblies were made up of the middle class. So it was all wealthy white dudes for the most part. So we had this small population of farmers and artisans, and then the rest were like wealthy merchants, lawyers, planters that had these like huge plantations. But then after the Revolution, the middle class representation doubled. And even a few people of, what are called lower classes, even people with not much money at all, started joining the assemblies. And this is truer in the western states near the frontier, where the U.S. is expanding. And so over on the East Coast, where more merchants and lawyers and stuff made up the government, they thought that, ordinary people were unfit to rule, that they would only be concerned with local interests, not the good of the state. And then we start having a discussion of what we're going to do about the Northwest Territory. because we really need to get government settled in that area. And this is the Northwest Territory here. Today makes up Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And so a lot of new settlers were moving into that area after the war. And so Congress adopted 3 different ordinances to sort of deal with that. The first one was in 1784, and this was Thomas Jefferson's plan, was to divide that area into 10 states, which would be admitted into the Union when their populations were high enough. And until their populations were high enough, they would just rule themselves, be like democratic self-rule by all free adult males. Okay, so, and as you can tell, that's kind of a vague plan. 1785 is when we get this mechanism for dividing and selling land. So everything in these areas gets divided up into squares. So we have like some large squares, some small squares. Large squares can be divided up into even more and more squares. So just all different sizes of squares of land that would be sold off. And Congress thought that the land would sell really quickly, but it was too expensive for most farmers to go out there and purchase it. So it didn't sell quickly. And Congress ended up selling it to a private company of land speculators, like 6 million acres of that land. And these speculators did not like Thomas Jefferson's democratic self-rule plan, and so they got rid of it in favor for this third Northwest Ordinance. So the Northwest Ordinance put Congress in control of the territory by appointing a governor, a secretary, and 3 judges. It decided it would be divided into between 3 and 5 states, and as we know, it ended up being 5. And when the population of those reached 5,000 free adult males, they would get a legislature. When the population reached 60,000, they could apply for statehood. And in this area, they outlawed slavery. But it was understood as part of this deal that if enslaved people went to that area to gain freedom, they would be returned to the South. They were also given some basic rights, so education, trial by jury, freedom of religion. And so this was seen as a success in incorporating the frontier into the Union, because it minimized tensions between the wealthy Easterners and the democratic Westerners by having this stronger plan in place. But because it limited slavery in the area, it did start to deepen that division between the North and the South, because Congress was getting involved in the issue of slavery. Okay, let's see if I have enough time for the next slide. Let's give it a shot. Okay, economics. So at the start of the Revolutionary War, Americans lost all of their trade benefits and credit from Great Britain. And so after the war, Britain and France started flooding American markets with these luxury European goods that Americans were really eager to buy. And so a lot of them took out loans, they started going into debt. At the same time, Congress didn't have enough money to pay for the war that was really expensive, and so they started printing tons of money, like $400 million worth of money to just start paying things off. And this money was backed by promises of future taxes, not wartime taxes. And so during the war, when the army lost several battles, this money ended up becoming worthless. And so by 1781, it wasn't really any good. So we had all this worthless money. There was, a wartime shortage. Goods started costing more and more. And then again, we had this flooding of European goods. So Congress was really powerless. They were in a tricky position because money in the United States was worthless. Congress couldn't regulate trade. That was part of the Articles of Confederation. And imported goods were just rushing into the States. Gold and silver, like any of that money that was worth anything, was rushing out to Europe. Congress couldn't tax, so there was no reduction of this public debt. And they tried to gain more power to fix this economic situation, but there was resistance from within those states. The wealthy thought that, I have to pause. Okay, we'll be back with a part 2.